All right, now I want to speak to you briefly about what I've been doing and then take your questions. For those of you who are not familiar with my work, I usually write nonfiction about gender issues, but 3 years ago I began to notice that many of the elements I was seeing the Bush administration putting into place in relation to liberty seemed familiar to me historically. And I'm Jewish, and so certain things are sort of part of our cellular memory, I believe. And I felt like there are echoes from other moments in the past. And the first echoes I was aware of were of Germany in the early 30s. So in conversation with a dear friend and a mentor, who's the daughter of Holocaust survivors, she insisted that the things I was seeing and recognizing had happened in Germany in the early 30s. And she insisted that I sit and read those histories. And when I did so, I realized that in fact she was right, and that there were many echoes. Tactics, strategies, laws, sound bites that were being recycled essentially from the early 30s, when a small group of people legally came to power. A small group of people used the law to subvert the law in a fragile parliamentary democracy. So then, when I saw that, I looked at other times and places where a would-be dictator sought to close a democracy or crush a democracy movement. It didn't matter if this dictator was on the left or on the right. So I looked at Mussolini's Italy. I mentioned Germany in the 30s, Stalin's Russia, of course, East Germany in the 50s, Czechoslovakia in the 60s, Pinochet's coup in Chile in '73, and the Chinese crackdown on the democracy movement at the end of the 80s. And when I looked at all of these times and places, I saw that there were these 10 classic steps that every would-be dictator always used to close down a democracy or crush a democracy movement, and that we were seeing those 10 steps put in place in the United States of America. And what they are, you can imagine, I'm a pacer, can you hear me if I pace and speak like this, or can you not hear me in the back? It's okay? All right. These steps are so recognizable in retrospect. The first thing a would-be dictator always does is to invoke a terrifying internal and external threat, often a real one, which will be hyped. Often they'll use forged documents to hype the threat. We've seen that. The second step is to create a prison system outside the rule of law where torture takes place. And what you always see is once the state establishes the right to torture, a legal justification for torture, they begin by torturing those on the margins, and they always move eventually to directing violence against those at the heart of civil society, journalists, editors, opposition leaders, outspoken clergy, and labor leaders. The third step, and I'm racing through these, of course, if I elaborate this at much greater length in the end of America, but the third step you always see is the development of a paramilitary force that's not answerable to people, in this case Blackwater. And many of you know that in violation of Posse Comitatus, the 1807 Insurrection Act, Bush redeployed troops from Iraq to the United States of America, and 3,400 to start with. Then the day Obama was elected, he deployed 2 more troops, and plans are on track to have 20,000 active military policing civilian streets in the United States of America, unless you all put that at the top of your agenda, as well as the other people fighting what's left to do in this fight. The fourth step you will see is the establishment of a surveillance society, a surveillance apparatus aimed at ordinary people. And just in the car on the way over here, I got an email from Mark Miller at NYU documenting the fact that a whistleblower has now come forward from the NSA to confirm that every journalist in America has been under surveillance. And I can't wait to see, my own file, what I'm gonna pick up for dinner, and I shudder to think that every journalist in America and everyone in America has been under surveillance. The fifth thing you see is you start to see the infiltration of citizens groups, and that's been well established with this administration. You start to see the targeting of key individuals, well-known people like the Dixie Chicks, Dan Rather, Valerie Plame, face career setback smears or sometimes more aggressive targeting. You start to see restrictions against the press. Josh Wolf, no relation, in federal prison for 7 months because he refused to turn over a source. Bill Keller, the executive editor of the New York Times, threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act for disclosing the surveillance of banking records illegally. And those of you who remember history know that the Espionage Act was last used in the run-up to World War I and used to target journalists and activists and people like you and me, people who were arrested in mass sweeps, beaten, sometimes in prison, warrantless arrests. It silenced dissent in America for a decade. So the resurrection of the Espionage Act. Finally, you start to see legislation like the proposed nightmarish bill, H.R. 1955, right out of Stalin's playbook, which starts to criminalize thought and speech. And you start to see legislation and discourse that expands the definition of terrorist, like the Minnesota Patriot Act or the Patriot Act itself, in which ordinary Americans engaged in exercising their First Amendment rights in St. Paul are being prosecuted. 8 Americans are being prosecuted as terrorists for speaking. That's again right out of Hitler's playbook, right out of Mussolini's as well. And finally, and when I make these comparisons, I'm not saying the magnitude of the one is like the magnitude of the other. I'm saying this is what you see when it starts. These are the pieces that get put into place when someone wants to close an open society. The last thing you see when a would-be dictator seeks to crush a democracy is you start to see the subversion of the rule of law and legislation making it easier to declare martial law. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the 2007 Defense Authorization Act, which would let the president essentially redeploy the National Guard, which is now answerable to the people, as his own private military, federalize the National Guard by declaring a state of emergency, and now he actually has his own military to deploy. And those of you who know how police states work know how dangerous it is for the executive to have his own personal military to whom the military has to be responsive and not the will of the people. You also start to see that the overt suppression of the rule of law, ignoring the rule of law, like when Congress subpoenaed Josh Bolten and Harriet Miers, and the White House said, too bad, your Congress, too bad. Or the abuse of signing statements, too bad, your Congress, doesn't matter. Or the destruction of evidence with the CIA, the missing CIA tapes, too bad, rule of law doesn't matter.